Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about a popular crop around here called horseradish. My neighbor shared with me some horseradish roots earlier this season, a couple of months ago, and I was able to take some of these roots and leaf crowns and plant them in the garden, and so far they have been growing really well. Let's take a look. So here we have some horseradish. Of course you can see the huge leaves that they produce in copious amounts. I have about 3 main plants here, and then I have 3 other plantings that I did from the root cuttings, and those were just from some of the smaller, younger roots that had broken off of the main plants, and they still sprouted. Before I transplanted these, I actually put down a bunch of compost on top of the soil. One reason being is that the soil here is already in a pretty poor condition, so I put down the compost. Now when it comes to many plants, you generally don't want to plant them directly in the compost, especially not with large amounts of compost, because the compost can actually burn some of the plants. However, this is not the case with horseradish. In fact, it might be the horseradish that burns the compost. A bunch of cruciferous vegetables seem to be fairly tolerant of larger amounts of compost. And on that same note, you can also use this plant in companion planting. You have to be careful with it because certain plants aren't tolerant of it. The volatile compounds that it produces can have inhibitive growth on certain plants. However, it can be beneficial to certain crops like maybe fruit trees or potatoes to help keep away potato beetles and also deter voles and mice. Now I have not had a chance to really explore that aspect of it, so I don't really know if it actually works or not. But I'd also like to experiment with growing this maybe near or around sunchokes to see if that would also help to deter some of the critters like voles and mice that can nibble away at the tubers. And this plant may also be a good companion to strawberries and rhubarb as well. So anyway, after I put down the compost, I planted the leaf crowns and roots, and then I put a layer of essentially just grass clippings on top of that. A fairly thick layer, maybe an inch, inch and a half thick, and I did that to help hold in the moisture in the soil and the compost to help protect the plants and the roots from excessive sun exposure or heat. The other thing when I transplanted these horseradish plants is they need a lot of water, and a lot of regular and consistent water for the first initial few weeks after they've transplanted, because they need to have a chance to adjust and adapt to their new environment. So what I did was I came out here and I watered them every day since I transplanted them for at least the first 3 or 4 weeks, because I noticed that if I skipped a day or two, especially on some days it got kind of hot, the plants would begin to wilt and not look very healthy. But when I added water back into the equation, they perked right back up and seemed to be quite happy. So in summation, I planted these right in the compost. I put grass clippings on top and I watered them well and regularly and deeply. This is a hardy perennial crop. It is a cruciferous vegetable. It's hardy up to zone 2. So in terms of edibility, of course, we know the roots are very popular in making a sauce or a condiment where you can grind them up and add in some vinegar and maybe other flavorings as well, and it makes a really hot, spicy dish that can really clean out your sinuses. Of course, a word of caution on that: if you're blending them up or if you're grating them up, it's advised to do it in a well-ventilated area, or if you blend them up in a blender or food processor, be careful of when you lift the lid after it's blended, because you don't want it to burn your eyes, your nose, or anything like that, because it's really quite caustic. It contains some very powerful volatile compounds. Of course, in the past it has also been used as a digestive tonic, digestive stimulant, maybe not as commonly known, but the leaves are also edible. They're not as nearly as hot and spicy as the roots are. However, if you eat 2 or 3 of them, the spiciness is cumulative. The younger and tender leaves are always more preferable, especially if you're going to eat them raw. The more intermediate sized leaves you can cook up into dishes or into soups, or maybe you can blend it up into some type of dish you might be eating, and they'll add a little bit more of a mild horseradishy kind of kick to whatever your dish you're making. Maybe if you want to be really creative with making hummus, adding in some horseradish leaves or even some horseradish root for that matter can be a very interesting path to take. Other than that, I'm not super familiar with preservation of horseradish, other than also the roots can also just be stored in the ground as they are, because they're really resistant to vole and mice damage and any herbivorous activity like that. They can be harvested. You might be able to harvest them in the fall. In the winter. Early spring is probably more popular. In certain cultures, it may be more traditional to harvest the roots early in spring. On a note, when making the sauce, when you grate up the horseradish root, a chemical reaction takes place. And what you're tasting when you taste that hot, spicy flavor is actually the effects of a chemical reaction going on. And if you've just ground up the root and you're hoping to maybe store it for a few days, that reaction will eventually dissipate and disappear from the root, unless if you add vinegar. Adding vinegar will actually put that reaction in a state of suspension, and you'll be able to store the grated horseradish root for a much longer period of time. Of course, if you've ever made the condiment mustard before, you'll know that we add vinegar into the ground mustard seed powder because we want to preserve that chemical reaction, that spicy flavor that's also present in the mustard seed. And of course, when you add the vinegar into the mustard along with the salt, right, that can last indefinitely. The flower tops and flowering buds are also, of course, edible, as it is, a distant relative of broccoli. Now, horseradish can be a little bit more potent than some other cruciferous vegetables that we may be more familiar with. Some of us may know that the cruciferous vegetables can contain potentially some goitrogens or other chemical compounds that can inhibit your body's ability to use and store iodine. Iodine is, of course, important for a variety of physiological functions in our bodies, and if we don't have enough of it, there can be some adverse effects. So as with anything out there, all things in moderation, right? But in a well-balanced diet, horseradish can be an excellent addition. Horseradish can also function as a dynamic accumulator. You can see these huge leaves, the roots, especially once they get established, can reach deep into the ground and extract a lot of minerals and nutrients that may be not as easily accessible to other plants that may be more shallow rooted that are growing around it. So of course the bigger leaves, if you ever feel like you need to thin back your horseradish, can be an excellent addition to the compost, or maybe it would work as like a temporary mulch around a plant that may be susceptible for mouse or vole browse. I don't know, I'm just throwing that idea out there. For many cruciate plants, and I'm sure the horseradish is no exception, they can also hyperaccumulate selenium, and making it more bioavailable to other plants as these cruciate plants break down and decompose. And selenium is of course a trace mineral that has been largely depleted or can be quite deficient in many agricultural soils from overuse and erosion and others and similar activities. So it may be a good plant to help in the process of soil reclamation or soil regeneration, where it's reaching its deep taproots down into the soil, extracting that selenium up into its leaves and the rest of the plant, and then as it breaks down, or if you use the leaves as a mulch, it will then release some of these selenium compounds back into the soil in the more superficial layers, and then the bacteria and the fungi can break down these leaves and have access to all these minerals that can then feed the plants around them. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this video on horseradish. Maybe it's a plant that you might want to consider adding to your garden. It's got so many different uses. It's not just edible, it of course has some medicinal applications as well, but it's also a very helpful plant around the garden, maybe to help repel pests or to help reclaim and regenerate the soil. So there's a lot more to horseradish than what some people may think. It's not as popular of a garden plant as maybe it could be in many cases, but it's a fantastic plant to get to know and to have around. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care.